Welcome to Mental Health and Faith, a closer look. I'm Carolyn Cooper, and my ministry name is Mental Health Connect. My mission is to offer encouragement and to help you find your way into this complicated world. There will be links and resources in the show notes. You'll want to check those out. Now sit back and enjoy the show. Hi, this is Carolyn, and I am back with my friend Chris Morris. This week, he is going to be sharing with us about an experience he had in his life that is really relevant to September as Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. This month, the focus in the mental health community is really on suicide because it is a major issue in our world and in our country. And Chris has some amazing information to share around that and his personal experience that I know you'll find very exciting. But Chris, why don't you start off for anyone that did not listen to the last episode, give us a little introduction of who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Chris Morris. I am a mental health coach and advocate for the church. I really focus on trying to tear down a lot of the misinformation and the myths that are out there around mental health and faith.
And that's so important to do. I know in our last episode, we did talk a little bit about that it has not always been easy to be a Christian in a church with a mental illness. And that has changed some. That still is an issue for a lot of people, but I really admire what you do to make a difference in that way. So Chris's book is called Resilient and Redeemed, and it is amazing. I recommend it whether you have mental illness or other emotional issues yourself, or whether you want to understand maybe a loved one who is going through mental illness or mental challenges of some kind. It's an excellent book to read, very readable. I really enjoyed it. And in the last part of that book, Chris, you share about suicidal ideation and how that impacted your life and led to a suicide attempt. So I do want to tell our readers to be aware that Chris is going to be sharing some very sensitive and could be traumatic for some of you who are listening to hear his story related to suicide. So just be aware of that. But Chris, why don't you tell us a little about that experience?
Sure, it was late summer, several years ago, and I had been struggling with depressive thoughts for a while. I didn't have great self-awareness at the time, so I didn't really recognize how dominant those depressive thoughts were. And I also didn't have people who were speaking those sort of things into my life. Both of those things have changed now for the better. But at any rate, that's sort of the space I found myself in. We were in a two-story house at the time. I was downstairs with the family. We were just having a good family time, goofing off, talking, watching television. And then I had this thought pop into my head as clear as day. And the thought said, Chris, you should go upstairs and you should take that medication and end it. It's never going to get better. And I didn't question it. I didn't interrogate it. I didn't do anything, but I sort of accepted it. So I went upstairs. I took about 75 pills, a combination of a bunch of different things. And at this point, I need to sort of transition to my wife's perspective in the story, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the psych ward angry that I was still there. But, to sort of pick up her side of the story, this, by the way, was probably the most difficult part of the book to write. And what made it hard was having to revisit this with my wife.
Mm.
She, of course, has her own traumatic experience related to my poor decision. So walking through it with her in a pseudo healed state for the purposes of of writing the book is that was really, really hard for us to do.
I could
Um,
I could see
Go ahead.
that because you didn't remember. I mean, you were out. You didn't
Right,
know this part until after the fact. So
right.
that must have been, yeah, I could see where that would really be a hard thing to do, to be told from her perspective something that you had no memory of.
It was difficult for me to hear. It was probably more difficult for her to share
Hmm.
because I want to be careful not to tell her story
Hmm. Right.
too much. We all have lies that we almost subconsciously believe. And one of the things that has been a lie for a variety of reasons in her life is I'm not worth sticking around for.
Oh.
So unfortunately, my suicide attempt sort of reinforced this thing that she believed that wasn't true in her life.
Hmm.
Um, so circling back to what actually happened next, my wife thought I had just gone upstairs to take a nap. It was not unusual for me to take naps in the middle of the day. It's part of how depression looks in my life, is I'm just very low energy and I just disappear randomly and I go take a nap and I'm gone for 3 hours. She came upstairs and found me sprawled on the ground with a cut across my chest because I had fallen on the dog kennel. And she had this moment where she had to make a decision. What am I going to do? Because her immediate reaction was frustration
Hmm.
and anger with me. Now, beyond the typical reasons, which are completely legitimate to feel that way, when I had been in the psych ward 2 years prior, we had we had caught it before I had a suicide attempt, but it was I was thinking those same thoughts about pills, and I committed to my wife a couple years prior. I'm never going to do this again. And then fast forward 24 months, and I've done exactly what I said I was never going to do again. So she had this decision of, I'm just going to be really frank about it. She had to decide, am I going to do anything about this or am I just going to let him lay there and let whatever happens happen?
Hmm.
And she had that struggle within herself. And thankfully, because she's a wonderful woman with a heart of gold, she decided to try and help me. Now, this is where the mechanics of our marriage come into play. My wife is 5'2". I'm 6'7",
Oh.
300 pounds.
Oh.
And remember, I was upstairs.
Oh man.
So her first thought was, well, let me just get him to the hospital myself because I don't want to have 911 come in because then it'll just produce more trauma for everyone else.
Hmm.
And I was able to sort of walk down the stairs, but then my body just gave out. And so she's like, well, I'm done. She's 5'2". She can't carry 300, and she's not a bodybuilder, so she can't carry a 300-pound dude without help. So she called 911. They came and they took me to the local hospital. And because this was during COVID times, getting information from the hospital to my wife was almost impossible. They were just not forthright people didn't know what to do during COVID.
Hmm.
And there was so much anxiety. So a lot of the normal kinds of practices of care that would take place just were sort of thrown out the window because everyone was scared.
Right.
One of the unfortunate side effects of that is that Barbara basically didn't hear anything about my recovery for 3 or 4 days.
Oh
Keep in
man.
mind, I was passed out trying to overdose on meds, and then she didn't know what happened for several days. So there's all this anxiety in her heart. around it at work.
Hmm.
Um,
Oh.
and now we can sort of circle back to me waking up in the psych ward. I woke up in the psych ward. My very first thought, this is how sort of how dark of a place I was in, was crap. I can't even commit suicide right. Here's
Hmm.
one more thing that I failed at. And it became something to beat myself up about. And it was very, very hard.
Do you
Very, go ahead.
do you think that that's a common thing for people who are in such a deep depressed state that they think, oh gosh, I can't even do that right? Do you think that's a pretty common mindset?
I want to be careful not to try and speak
Mm,
to what might be normal for
mm,
other people. What I
right.
can say is it makes sense to me
Hmm.
because part of the depression cycle, part of the suicidality cycle is something like this. I'm a terrible human being that's not worth staying on this planet.
Hmm. Yeah,
So it would make sense to me that that would be part of the process after a failed suicide attempt. But I don't know for sure.
and I really appreciate that response because we know that everyone is so unique. Trauma looks different from person to person. Mental illness looks different from person to person. And you're absolutely right. Going through the experience you went through is going to look different for each individual. So thank you for
Definitely.
making sure to point that out.
Of course, of course. So I stayed in this place of like deep despair for probably 2 or 3 days.
Mm.
And then the only way I can describe it is, and then God broke through.
Yes.
And I was sitting in the general seating area. We were watching, I don't know, some cinematic masterpiece, Rambo 17 or something like that. And I felt this quickening in my spirit that God wanted to say something to me. And I had no idea what God might want to say to post suicidal Chris, but I knew that I wouldn't come through sliced alone.
Yeah.
So, so I went into my room and I sat down on the edge of the bed and I just sort of waited. And after a few moments, I heard the Holy Spirit whisper to me clear as day, Chris, I still love you. And I argued with him. You
Yeah.
know, you can't love me. I'm a couple days removed from a suicide attempt. My wife is rightfully upset with me. I'm sure my kids are traumatized. I don't even love me. You can't love me. And I was gearing up for an argument. Here, quick little piece of advice for all the listeners. Whenever you think you're going to argue with God and win, it's never going to work.
Thank
So
goodness,
I was
right?
geared, yes. So I was gearing up for this argument, and the Holy Spirit just didn't engage with me in that. Instead, he repeated, Chris, I still love you. And and for some reason it hit different the
Mhm.
second time. And just the beginning of a spark of hope was placed in my spirit that sounded something like this. If if the God of the universe, the most holy being that ever exists, who created everything, sees something worthwhile in me, maybe I should too. And it really came as that maybe, there was not certainty because I didn't have the faith and I wasn't in the place to have the certainty that there would be anything that could be worthwhile about me. But I was willing to entertain an alternative story.
That's
So that was
profound.
sort of,
Yeah,
yes.
very profound. Um, that he go ahead, go ahead. I'm just in awe.
Nope.
I'm in awe of how God spoke to you. Because first of all, he spoke, but you had to choose to listen.
Hmm.
And I think people need to remember that, especially, if you're a Christian. And you want to hear what God has to say to you. You have to put yourself in a position to listen, and you did that. You separated
Sure.
out, you went to a room, you waited to hear the still small voice, and you did. And that's just profound. I wish I did that more often. Um, and I think that's important for our Christian listeners to realize. Put yourself in that position to hear the Lord speak. So,
Absolutely.
that was great. Keep going. Go ahead. What happened next? You had a
So
little.
that was sort of part one of my recovery plan, if you will. The next part came the very next day. My pastor from the church that we're still attending came and visited me, and I'll be honest, I was freaking out. I've been gaslit by so many Christian leaders, and
Mm,
that was not when I was in a psych ward. So I was thinking to myself, I don't even know if I want to talk to this guy. I think Marty's not the guy who will kick you when you're down, but I've never seen him from a psych ward before, so I don't know. So I really went back and forth like, do I even want to engage with him? I'm going to show up. I should be busy. It's very funny when you talk about, oh, I'm unavailable when you're in a psych ward. What do you have going on exactly? But I digress. I hope you don't mind the humor that I'm interjecting. This is part of my process.
mhm.
Um, but I decided to go and talk with him, go and meet with Marty. And we did some small talk. That was awkward. How are you doing? I'm in a psych ward. How do you think I'm doing? Are you having a good time? He didn't actually ask that question. I'm making light when I say that. We had some small talk, and then I sort of saw a change come over his countenance, and I thought to myself, here it comes. He's going to tear me down. I regret coming. But instead, that moment of teardown never came. Instead, he leaned forward, he looked me right in the eyes, and he said, Chris, we can't have this happen again. Don't misunderstand what I mean, though. The church that you're a part of, that I'm a part of, is not the full church if you're not in it.
Wow.
There are things that you bring to the table. There are skills that you have. There are abilities that you have. There are relationships you develop that no one else can have. And Chris, God's not done writing your story yet. So this was a profound moment for me in a couple ways. That the first way is that there was a restoring, to borrow my agent Mary DeMuth's word, restoring. There was a restoring of what I had experienced from Christian leaders in relation to my mental health. And it was a reminder, hey, you're not in the same place you used to be. You're you're in a safer space now. And then secondly, in the same way that God called me back to hope through his kind words the day before, Pastor Marty called me back into community. And
Oh,
he said, hey, there's a place for you. You're missed. You're needed. We love you. And let's get to work.
I'm getting goosebumps because it was something you needed to hear. What a wise man to approach you in that way, because that must have been exactly what you needed to hear.
It really was. I, I don't know that there could have been a better message for me to hear from my pastor in that moment.
Now, I'm sure that as life continued, it's not all of a sudden, wow, I'm back. I'm sure that there was a lot of
No.
work to do after this. Can you speak a little bit about when you came home? What was it like to transition back and focus on getting healthy again?
Sure. So the first thing that I had to do was have some really difficult conversations with everyone in my family.
Yes.
Trying to restore some sense of trust, some sense of hope that I wouldn't make this decision again. and, try to answer the really difficult questions like, why did this happen? Why did you do it this way? Why not that way? Why on Tuesday? Why not Wednesday? All these different questions. And every person that I engaged with for my family because they're all different personalities, had different approaches.
Mhm.
One of my boys who's pretty intellectually oriented, he was kind of rapid firing a bunch of factual questions at me. And, I did my best to answer those. Um, I look back on that conversation and I wish that I would have had the wherewithal to be able to say, hey, let's hit pause on all the fact questions and let's just deal with your heart here. I know you're hurting and I know you're confused. And I don't have all the answers for that, but I want to address it. And I didn't do that because I was exhausted. It's so draining being in a psych ward, even though it's not draining like in the way that if you work a 14-hour workday, but there's just so much soul work that you're doing and that you're trying to reestablish boundaries and safety lines. And that's hard work. So the first thing I had to do is walk through all those conversations. And then I had to figure out what are the non-negotiables that I need to have in my life to prevent this from happening again. And one of the things that I realized is, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not always the most self-aware emotionally or mentally about where I'm at. Some people have really good self-awareness. I'm just not one of those people. I want to be, and I'm better than I was then, but it's a struggle for me. So I found my wife and 3 or 4 other people who I gave permission to have really open conversations with me that say, hey, Chris, you seem like you're a little off kilter. Is everything okay? And for me to not fly off the deep end for someone asking me that question, but to answer them introspectively and thoughtfully, and to pay attention and to trust that these friends that God has put into my life might see something that I don't see. And then the flip side of that conversation is very similar. If I notice that I'm feeling off kilter, as soon as I notice, I made a commitment to these same people. Hey, I'm going to just be honest with you and tell you I'm struggling right now. And I'm not looking for you to be my therapist, but I am looking for you to support me, to identify if there's something you can help me work through, or to push me toward my therapist if that's where I really need to go. And that sort of brings me to the next thing that I need that became a non-negotiable for me is I need to be regularly seeing a therapist. I mentioned this earlier in the book. I had a couple really weird experiences with counselors that were not helpful for me. So I had made the poor, frankly, decision to forego any counseling. And I needed to, and I recognized post suicide attempt, I need to not do that anymore. And I need to regularly be engaged in counseling because something that I really struggle with, the technical term is catastrophizing.
Oh, yeah.
It's the fancy word for making mountains out of molehills.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an expert in making fake mountains. It's a real problem in my life. And I need people, professionals and friends, to help me realize, hey, you're like 17 steps down the road on a potential possibility that you don't even know if the first step is going to happen. So let's dial it back, let's calm down, and let's deal with what we can deal with right now. And the therapist that I had been seeing for a few years until pretty recently was really good at helping me to identify when I was doing that 17-step catastrophizing and helping me to bring it back to what's presently within my control. So that was another thing that I needed to do. And then the third thing that I realized I needed to do was establish some routines in my life. Um, I'm currently on disability. I don't work. I have a very part-time tax practice that I run,
Mm.
but outside of that and writing books, I have a fair amount of downtime because I'm on disability for a seizure disorder.
Mm.
Um, so it became really important for me to have, for lack of a better way to say, to have hooks in my day. So I established a morning routine, 4 or 5 things that I do every single morning that as soon as I wake up, well, okay, I wake up, I have coffee, then I do these things. I
Yes,
can't do anything without
priorities.
coffee. Yes. These things that I do, they help me to reestablish every single day. Here are some things that are true in my spiritual life. Here are some priorities I want to establish in my daily activities, and here are some things that are true about my relationship with God.
Oh, nice. Very good. Well, Chris, we could just go on and on and on, but what I'd like you to do is kind of to wrap up is speak to someone who's listening or watching this episode who may be thinking, wow, I'm having some thoughts too that are not healthy for me. What would you say to them would be maybe the number one thing they should do right now to address those suicidal thoughts?
I have to give two answers because I can never just give one.
Great. That's fine.
Um, the, the first thing I would say is if you have someone who you know is safe in your life, who is not going to gaslight you or say negative things to you if you share this with them, share what's going on in a fair amount of detail.
Mhm.
Mental illnesses and depression and suicidality in particular despise community. It hides in darkness and silence. So to the degree we can break that silence, it's going to be to our benefit.
Mhm.
Now, the reason I want to give a second answer is because not everyone has that safe person. And I
Mhm.
recognize that. I feel very blessed that I have four or
Mhm.
five people
Yeah,
that I can talk to. Not everyone has that.
right.
So if you find yourself isolated and alone, what I would suggest that you do is pull out your Bible and look at Philippians 4:8.
Ah, yes.
I can never get the
Yeah,
list right, but it
I
says
know.
something like this.
Mhm.
Whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, if there is anything that is of good report, think on these things. And what
That
I want you to do is to look at that verse and use that verse to interrogate the thoughts that are in your head. So what that looks like is this thought that I'm thinking, is it honorable? If it's not, then don't think that, then let it go.
mhm.
And you might need help to do that. You might need to work with a professional to get there. But the first step is walking through Philippians 4:8 and interrogating your thoughts. Because if you can recognize these thoughts are not helpful thoughts, then that's half the battle.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times we can't even differentiate what's good and what's bad because we're just in darkness and confusion.
Because when you
Mhm.
have a mental illness, a lot of that, your mind plays tricks on you. You
Yes.
think things that aren't true, and the enemy doesn't help either. Chris, I'm going to throw out one more thing. Call 988.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank
That's
you. I
another,
forgot that.
yes. So I'll have information. That is the crisis, suicide and crisis lifeline, the national number, but you are connected with local resources. Chris, any final words? This has just been amazing.
I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my story and to offer some encouragement to folks. I really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. I'm really thankful that we could do this. So we'll wrap it up, and I'll just say check out his book. I will have a link to it in the show notes. Thank you for being here, and I'm sure we will stay connected.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me today, and please share your comments. Join the conversation on mental health and faith. And I would love to hear from you. My email is Carolyn, that's spelled Caroline, Carolyn at carolynScooper.com. And my contact information is also in the show notes. Have a blessed day.